see a lot of familiar faces, but for those of you that don't know me, I'm Courtnay Bauer, and I'm a member of the Visual Studies faculty here at SCI-Arc, and I've got the unique opportunity this evening to introduce you to Andrew Boulder. In the past years, I have come to know Andrew through academics, as he has taught at both UCLA, SCI-Arc, and Otis College of Art Design, through professional collaboration and as well as socially. Andrew comes to our architectural community with a past in political science as well as experience in real estate, finance, and business development. He received his Master's of Architecture from our neighbor UCLA and has worked with a number of innovative Los Angeles design firms. Bringing his diverse knowledge, Andrew joined Ben Freinger as co-principals of the Los Angeles Design Group, the LADG, as you may come to know it. Having witnessed it firsthand, I can attest to the uncommon, fluid working relationship between Ben and Andrew, able to pick up where the other has left off when necessary, while knowing just the right amount of prodding and provocation required to keep the other on his toes with regard to both design and business challenges of the practice. Their office is located in Hollywood and averages a handful of people. LADG is admittedly a young architectural practice. However, I propose that it is with some wisdom that they have approached building their practice. They are in relentless and constant pursuit of build work as a mode to expand their experience and client base. They have chosen to work in the opposite direction of most today, building innovation and intent and novelty into what may begin as ordinary projects. Their realized work is not overburdened with the need for each project to be critically positioned in today's architectural discourse. However, it is supplemented and guided by their ongoing research and development. This pursuit has led them through projects ranging in scale from fixtures to urban interventions. The office is diligent in its choice and execution of tools and techniques to achieve each project's goals, while not limited to any one digital or physical process. This evening, Andrew will be presenting a range of projects expanding on the office's unique approach to practice. Without any further delay, and with some pride, I introduce my colleague and friend, Andrew Boulder.
Thanks, Courtney. So when I'm in the audience for a lecture, I like to think it's very polite when the lecturer is very explicit about the contents of what I'm about to suffer through. So I would like to do you guys the same favor in 3 parts. First, there will be a round of thank yous. Second, we will get into a polemic that involves a little bit of art history. I'll go as lightly on the polemic as possible because, of course, that runs the greatest risk of being boring if the polemic is bad. And last, we're going to show a selection of 5 recent projects from our office. So first, the pleasantries and the thank yous. Once again, thank you so much to Courtnay Bauer. I have to say it's a little bit intimidating being introduced by someone who I consider in some ways to be a superior practitioner and designer, so thank you so much for your kind words. I'd like to thank my business partner, Benjamin Freinger. It's mostly by coincidence that I'm the one up here presenting, but certainly the practice is the 2 of us. And again, in some cases, I would consider him the more accomplished half of the practice. There are a number of people who have worked very hard in our office. I won't name the kind of exhaustive list of people who have participated in these projects. We've tried to credit them where possible on the slides. I would like to thank, in particular, Noah Rubin, Antonio Torres, Carrie Smith, and Jenny Lee for their hard work in assembling the materials presented here this evening. Thanks to the Student Lecture Committee, and also the faculty, staff, and administration here at SCI-Arc for generously hosting events like this. So, part 2, the polemic. Am I in the light? Am I headed toward the light? Okay. So beyond Courtney's very generous characterization of our firm, I think it's fair to say that we are an anxious and somewhat nervous group of people. Anxious and nervous in the sense that we have a great deal of concern about the state of emerging architectural practice and the activities of architects who describe themselves as part of the avant-garde. That statement is not meant to be accusatory or confrontational. Certainly our friends and colleagues and all kinds of people we respect and admire are part of the architectural avant-garde, and on good days, we'd like to think that our firm is counted among them. As opposed to a confrontation, that anxiousness and concern and worry is meant as a kind of provocation towards self-awareness. A provocation to collectively ask the question, are we collectively advancing the state of contemporary design? I think it's important to acknowledge a kind of habit toward crisis mongering that architects have. So we're showing this slide of Mel Brooks and high anxiety, both as an indication of our actual anxiousness, but as a kind of mockery of the fact that we feel the need to kind of expose yet another crisis in architecture, a field that sort of never seems to rest and be free of crisis. So to return to the question, are we collectively advancing the state of contemporary design? Admittedly, that's a vague question with all kinds of problems of definition embedded in it. We're also aware of the messiness and occasional failure that attend questions like this and the kinds of work that they produce. But I think it's fair to say that we're okay with a certain kind of messiness and even embrace it as a mark of the new, the emerging topic. We think it's possible to ignore these problems of definition, ignore these problems of messiness, and reiterate the spirit of the question. Is emerging practice actually emerging, advancing, and exploring new territory? We're anxious because we're not sure the answer to that question is yes. We're anxious because we don't hear very many people asking that question. We're anxious because at stake is the validity of our contemporary moment in architecture. And we're anxious because we think we've seen a contemporary moment like this before. So, the problem. Here comes our history. At the end of the Italian Renaissance in about 1520 and before the advent of the Baroque in around 1600, there's a period that we now term Mannerism. It is not so much a clear style or a movement in itself. Rather, Mannerism is characterized as a movement between, from the Renaissance to the Baroque. And I should be specific that we're talking about the Italian Renaissance. It's important because of its relationship to what came before and what came after. So on the left, we see a high Renaissance work. It's Raphael's Deposition of Christ, painted in 1507. And the project of Renaissance figural painting in the religious mode is on full display. There is a deep spatial field as Raphael attempts to wrestle the device of perspective representation, which is still relatively new at this point, wrestle the deployment of that device with the intimacy of the subject. There are only a few people in the foreground. The surface characteristics of skin are subordinate to the look or emotion that is being conveyed. Where bodies are covered, drapery is used as a device to reveal human form, and the overwhelming fascination is on figural representation. I would argue that it's an experimental and radical painting in the sense that technique is subordinate to the polemical and intellectual aims of the painting. As a consequence, the aesthetic is risky and occasionally counterintuitive. And this is particularly evident in the use of drapery, where there are moments where it looks wet or kind of defies gravity in order to amplify the posture of the figure or to amplify some specific figural characteristic. On the right is Jacopo Pontormo's Deposition of Christ as well, painted in 1526, 19 years later. And this is at the very beginning of the Mannerist period, about 5 years into it. I would argue that something different is happening here, and it's not clear that the work can be called polemical or even a project at all. The representation of space has been flattened in favor of a graphic arrangement of figures that privileges the kind of flat graphic quality. Drapery has become an object of fixation, and it is excessive to the point of dominating the figures who wear it. Folds proliferate and become highly organized, formed, and geometricized. There is a preoccupation with preserving the smooth continuity of flesh in favor of the seams, wrinkles, and disturbances that convey emotion in the high Renaissance work. So to crudely paraphrase this transition between the Renaissance and the Mannerist, I would argue that Mannerism is preoccupied with the extensions of the techniques of the Renaissance. Works are subsumed by technique. Newness and experimentation have been suppressed in favor of repetition. That's repetition both on the surface of the painting itself, as in the case of the elaborate folds of the drapery, but also across works in an artist's output as the same techniques are reiterated again and again with ever greater attention to technical issues. So we think that 2009 and 2010 are a mannerist moment in the trajectory of avant-garde architecture. And you've got to forgive us here for not naming names and presenting images. We can call that kind of a fear of embarrassment, I suppose. We would say that the 1990s were a renaissance moment during the introduction of the digital. Architecture was experimental and new as it came into contact with new polemics that attended the introduction of digital media in architecture. Techniques were continually invented in order to respond to problems, and the aesthetic of many projects occupied risky, messy, counterintuitive territory as a result. Today is different. There is a preoccupation with repetition, and sometimes complex repetition as a substitute for rational thought. Scripting has emerged in some practices as a substitute for design, and it seems to us that scripting can only emerge in the mannerist moment, where the techniques of the previous generation can be distilled, codified, and eventually encoded as a computer language. There is a large professional consensus on the use of surface-driven modeling software, perhaps with a bent on producing forms that are more concerned with the exterior aspect of a shape than with issues of interior spatiality. Skinning, tiling, and panelization problems have been foregrounded in architectural education. And affect, we would argue, has been reduced to an issue of the visual, or even just an issue of graphic saturation. A certain complexity of the visual field in terms of color, in terms of form, in terms of materiality, has become a hallmark of work that claims to be affect-driven or affectively oriented. It's not that these characteristics of our contemporary moment are necessarily bad, and in fact, they might be producing better architecture. Increased attention to technique means that avant-garde architecture is probably becoming more refined at the scale of detail and probably better constructed as well. The problem to us is more that technique and its insistent repetition are serving as substitutes for newness, experimentation, and rational thought. So the solution, drop it like it's fake. Drop it like it's fake because we're only arrogant enough to propose a new set of tactics for architecture, not arrogant enough to propose an entirely new version of the discipline. Drop it like it's fake science in small quotes, because we want to use the metaphor of the history of philosophy of science to shift back to a mode of inquiry that is hell-bent on the discovery of the new and the production of the experimental. So let's examine the tactics and advantages of fakeness, how it works, why it's valuable, and why our firm wants to use it. First, faking it is a term of art in jazz and music. It's a term for a musician who can play along with a melody that she does not know. It's distinct from improvisation and still allows a new kind of music to be sort of written on the fly that capitalizes on the melodic and structural strengths of the composed piece. We'll call John Williams, the composer of film scores like Star Wars, as the real, the scripted version, with his insistence on technique and repetition. We'll call Billie Holiday the master of faking it, particularly at the end of her career, with a voice kind of ruined by drugs and alcohol, where she's not even able to fully capture the melody, but is able to communicate something perhaps greater through faking it. Faking can be used as a decoy strategy that allows an architecture to masquerade as a member of a familiar class of projects while in fact doing something very different. As in a duck decoy that is designed to impersonate a duck but has the real purpose of murdering the animal. Fakeness also domesticates the risky and allows risk to become more easily popular and digestible. It can be the sheep's clothing for a wolf, as when Snoop Dogg takes his role as a pimp during his venture into the adult film industry. Heidi Fleiss, we would argue, is real and discomforting and a kind of ugly character, whereas Snoop Dogg is fake and reassuring. Fakeness is cheaper and easier in terms of its monetary and political costs. In the case of fake fur, it costs less and also liberates the material to pursue performance agendas other than those attached to the surface of a mammal. And finally, fakeness privileges materiality over meaning and romanticism. AstroTurf, for instance, is stripped of the romanticism of the growing living organism and is reduced to a set of material facts and quality. It is green, it is resistant, it is spongy, and it is rollable. So to be clear, fakeness is not just an attempt to do something different. Fakeness is something that rigorously attempts to subvert the value system of the real thing, or the actual thing. It holds the promise of subverting the value system of our mannerist moment in architecture, and perhaps dislodges us from the inertia of a technique-saturated milieu. Our projects attempt to pick moments where the techniques of contemporary practice are most clear, most unassailable, and in a sense, deliberately insert a counterfeit instead of technique. So part 3, on to 5 recent projects. The first is Giant Movie Screen, and surprise of surprises, it is actually a giant outdoor movie screen. This is a project currently going through schematic design in our office. The client brief is an outdoor movie theater and urban scale television set that uses a new high definition projection technology that is specifically designed to operate at extreme scales. The screen is about 40 feet tall and 60 feet long. That's just referring to the projection surface itself. And that's, for reference, again, to scale, that's slightly larger than the entire surface of a football field end zone. I think by comparison, the next largest outdoor screen is about 30 feet tall by 75 or 80 feet long, and it, I believe, belongs to the Atlanta Braves. The client brief, to return to that briefly, it's quite simple, really. The client is looking for a structural system to support a screen that is subject to extreme wind loads, like sails are subject to extreme wind loads. So we have this enormous vertical surface that's going to be kind of tossed around in slight winds. There's a call for service infrastructure like seating, parking, and concessions to serve an audience of up to several thousand visitors at a time. It's split between a drive-in movie theater and the kind of movie theater that you would walk into and sit at. And so the position of the screen has to respond to guests both arriving by car and sitting in their cars, and those who actually want to get out and sit in the service areas that we'll talk about in just a second. In case there are doubts, I'll just reiterate that this is an actual project in the sense that we are working with a developer and another architecture firm. Perhaps not a real project in the sense that this is intended more as a provocation to get someone who's thinking about the issue very differently to perhaps adjust their position somewhat. So as we began this project, it occurred to us that in this technique-driven mannerist moment, the idea of a structurally motivated project is kind of compulsory for emerging architectural practices. The deformed truss, the carefully articulated vault, kind of beautifully spatialized or colored tensile system, all seem to be common tropes in contemporary practice. And we certainly don't want to be left out of the emerging architectural scene. So we are also in the mood to use this extreme wind load or resistance to the extreme wind load as our kind of excuse for proceeding with this project. So not to bore people with process, because we before talking about process as a kind of excuse for architecture, but we'll do it just briefly because we think we have a good punchline. We worked our way through a number of potential structural precedents. The first, a tensile project that would recast the problem of stability in high wind loads as an issue of taut surfaces that cover a large area. A possible folded plate project that would develop a kind of corrugate on its backside, again to resist extreme wind loads on the front surface of the screen. Maybe a self-intersecting dome that would distribute the problem of load resistance over the maximum possible area using the lightest possible structural system so that the project begins to behave as a kind of structural foam. A transformed truss that becomes occupiable and kind of self-consciously rips off MVRDV city sofa. Or maybe a series of conic section arches that produce a shell structure that suspends the screen and produce a kind of cusp Baroque transition between shells. Or maybe just a beautiful tensile form that serves as a roof, and the tensile form does the job of absorbing wind load, and the screen itself is free from that capacity. So when we started to explore the universe that we had set up for ourselves, we were really disappointed. We could locate all of these projects on kind of familiar axes that we felt had already been played out by a number of other emerging practices. On one axis, there's a form that resists load or vectors that resist load. So essentially the difference between a space frame or truss system or perhaps a tensile system or other form active surface. On the other axis, structure operating as surface or structure operating as volume. We've seen collectively all of those projects before, and it seemed to us that the end game was a kind of beautifully articulated deformation of a known structural type. And to us, perhaps that system of operating or that tactic has been exhausted. And so we looked for a kind of singularity, a moment where the graph collapses and we can locate ourselves outside of this scheme that to us describes the kind of familiar territory of the structural deformation or the project of intricate structural componentry. So instead, we became preoccupied with this idea that our form, our solution, could do all of these things. And instead of casting the issue of resistance to structural loads as one of componentry or the deformation of a known structural type, we would reconsider the problem as one of stance or posture. Kind of like the way a lamp meets the ground or the way an athlete develops stance or posture in preparation for a physical activity. So for us, a simple hollow tube is good enough as a structural precedent. It develops stance or posture that can then be kind of reconceived as a posturing actually into the surface of the ground so that the lines of force that operate along the surface of the hollow tube extend out into the ground. And then there's a moment of twisting that we'll talk about a bit later as orienting the screen correctly for viewers in both the drive-in parking area and the seated zones, and also giving us an excuse to kind of separate structural moments. So it becomes very important to us to conceive of this stance as a move instead of a trace of structural transformation. A move that activates the ground and operates as a discrete and nameable feature. We want to think of this thing as a twist, a knot, a bow tie, that creates a wide-base hollow tube that is a structurally viable surface for projection, and at the same time thickens the ground and twists to accommodate viewing angles from both seated and drive-in viewers. In terms of the site plan, this is a double-lobe organization with the tower screen emerging between two mounds. The mounds rise approximately 50 feet off the surface of kind of the baseline zero condition of the surrounding territory, and they accommodate parking underneath and are sloped to accommodate seating on top. The rotation of the screen, again, accommodates these dual viewing angles, both here at the drive-in zone and here in the seating and concession service area. The single surface of the initial move is allowed to be eroded and colonized with various tropes of occupation. So there is no relentless fascination for us with the idea that a single surface must perform in several different ways to accommodate a very complex programmatic agenda. Cutting through the project at the zero level of the surrounding territory, there's a pedestrian access corridor in each lobe. That's the smaller of these two cavities underneath the mountains. And there's also kind of an enormous parking facility that can accommodate the number of cars that are expected for people who want to park and then work their way up to the seating surface. Throughout, there's a kind of distributed mode of circulation as people exit their cars and then percolate up through staircases. So we're interested in the way in which this organizational scheme actually lends different qualities to circulatory routes. So again, we would talk about pedestrians percolating up through the surface as they leave their cars, enter the pedestrian access zone, and then walk up these distributed sets of staircases. On the slope, people finding their seats traverse like skiers between rows of seats. And then inside the tower itself, circulation spins and winds vertically. So once again, it's very important to us that the form is not just a form unto itself, but that it provokes these qualitatively different modes of circulation that we can describe with words like percolation, traversing, and winding or spinning. So look a bit closer at the plan. It's actually a tower inside a tower scheme. So here at the base of the tower, approximately at the negative 15 feet mark below the zero plane of the surrounding territory, there's an open cavity underneath the tower where people can begin to circulate their way up the inner tower. And because of the fabric skin of the project that we'll see in just a moment, you can actually see the movie in reverse from the inside. In long section, there's this kind of battling organization of new Earth over old Earth. So there's this kind of encrusted surface of service infrastructure. That's the territory for people who have parked and gotten out of their cars and are now viewing the movie from a mound. And there's this kind of highly articulated underground where people park in what we'll begin to refer to as a kind of submarine-like structure that is designed to resist the crushing forces of this 50-plus feet of earth that's mounted above it. There is a loose fit between the tower and the adjacent ground. A loose fit that we kind of describe as a lapping or a sort of dress or tutu-like configuration where the skin of the interior tower made of glass has a loose relationship with the skin of the exterior tower that's made of fabric. And the kind of looseness of that fit promotes a kind of crevice relationship so that as you circulate up this interior tower, you're constantly aware of the variable depth of your relationship to this exterior fabric skin. Again, the relentlessness of the kind of single move or the monolithic form is attacked, and we're comfortable with relationships like a lapping condition where the skin of the fabric tower hits the ground. We're not committed to kind of literalizing the diagram of the initial formal operation. We're more committed to a kind of believable material construction of how those two objects might meet one another. So we start to talk about the second way in which this is fake. If the first kind of fake premise of this project is that we would submit a kind of decoy diagram of our location within contemporary practice. There are these two second ways in which we would consider this to be a project that capitalizes on fakeness. In terms of the way in which we are reconsidering normal relationships of objects that would generally participate in a drive-in movie theater scheme. So in the first, we've got a conventional relationship of a car, parking striping, a street lamp, and people. And we are thinking about all of the activities that kind of occur in that very simple, very flat relationship. That provides seating, that provides a place to eat, that provides a place to view the movie. It provides house lights, for lack of a better term, before and after the movie. And it provides a kind of circulatory scheme for people to move in and out. And all of that is done in a very kind of efficient and elegant way. It's merely the consequence of a car sitting on an asphalt surface that happens to be painted. Our fake intervention is to explode the kind of volume and material system of that very simple relationship between the car and its asphalt, and jam as much material and as much volume and as much space into those separate components as we can. So person becomes divorced from car. Parking, again, occupies this kind of vaulted zone underneath the mounds in each side of the load organization. The vaults are highly articulated because we know that they'll have to perform, again, as a kind of submarine-like structure that resists the crushing forces of all of this dirt piled on top of it. There are light and air shafts that we're calling either spangles or kind of a reptile skin that cover the holes in the ground to the extent that someone won't fall through, but at the same time are permitting kind of distribution of light and air to underneath so that the ground is shot through like with a shotgun blast of holes to below. And then there's the kind of smooth articulation of seating that gently follows the contours of the earth mound. Also kind of submerged and wallowing in the dirt surface are these concession stands that are rendered as pretty normal concession stand-like structures with four walls that are supported by the negative volume of these light and air shafts punching down to below. So the exterior of those light and air shafts is in some place hardened so that it can function as a sort of hollow column and do double duty for the wallowing volume of these concession stands. Again, people separated from cars, the sort of hyper-articulated or excessively articulated vaulting to produce the submarine operation of the parking structure below. The contrast of the smooth ribbed seating with the kind of spiky spangle that's producing a very kind of intentional incrustation of the top surface, and the negative of these columns that are punching through the earth, hardening at moments to support the operation of the roof of the concession stand. It made us really happy that the net result of this is to place the kind of most repetitive and graphically saturated moment 50 feet underground at the level of the parking. So as these kind of scattershot perforations in the dirt mounds make their way down to the vaulted surface, there's a distortion as they make contact with the top surface of those vaults. And we get a kind of delicate registration of light effects, both on the surface of the parking and in kind of the graphic pattern of these things as they glow from above. So there's also a second, what we'll call expansion or fake to the real or conventional relationship between objects that normally be found in a program like this. As it's currently configured, the project is simply a screen on a giant mast. And the attempt is to kind of compress all of the structural and resistance performance characteristics of this wind-load resisting device to the smallest possible footprint. So in the end, it turns out to be a kind of 2 foot by 2 foot plate steel column that is stabilized in part by its kind of cantilever foot that's embedded in the ground, but also by these cable ties that increase its kind of stance or area of resistance to wind loads. So once again, it's our ambition to sort of fake this elegant relationship and cram it full of more volume and more material than would normally be found in the conventional relationship between the two. So just as we saw the kind of cake slice of the separation of people and parking in the first expansion move, here we have a cake slice that reveals the operation of the two towers inside one another. Again, it's interesting to us that if you have a movie being projected on the front surface in this fabric screen, you'll kind of get an ambient glow and also the negative of that movie, perhaps too close to see as you're occupying the tower. But maybe it's also producing a kind of qualitatively saturated environment that's about the sort of blurred motion of these super scale figures that are sort of mere feet projected on the surface of the, mere feet away projected on the surface of the fabric screen. Again, it's kind of this dress-like layering of component against component that we find to be pretty compelling. And here, it's the twist of the movie screen as it accommodates angles of view for both drive-in viewers and people who walk in from their cars. That gives us an excuse to sort of load this expansion with even more material as we separate out different classes of load-resisting members. So there's vertical stuff, but then there are also these diagonal ties that stitch together the vertical members so that they can resist force laterally, and a kind of configuration that's similar to the way a Sukhov tower operates. Okay, and giant movie screen begin a project called Loftway. Loftway is a project downtown. It's actually just about a half-mile away on Hope Street, close to the intersection of 11th and Hope. It's a project for a small real estate office. It's about 500 square feet in size, and the real estate office specializes in selling surprise downtown lofts, and somehow they've managed to stay afloat and even thrive in the kind of crash of the downtown real estate economy. What's critical for us is that this is absolutely packed program. It's 500 square feet in size, but there are 5, sometimes 6 people working in this small office space, and there are clients who come to visit. So the programmatic demands of the client brief were absolutely ridiculous. They wanted a conference room, a separate area for the lead broker, and then 4, if possible, 5 separate desks for each real estate agent who would be assisting the lead broker. And then also a waiting room. So for us, it's important to start to think about this project as a consideration of the Sperry topsider shoe. And we love this shoe because for us it poses a special problem to contemporary issues of topology. So for those of you who are either too young or too old to remember the Sperry topsider, it's this incredibly popular shoe in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and is just now enjoying a kind of resurgence as a calling card for a certain brand of preppy hipsterism, I guess we can call it. I wouldn't be surprised to see a few Sperry topsiders in the audience today. The fake here is about a dialogue of issues of topology, particularly smoothness and continuity. Again, for us, this shoe poses a special problem for topology in these regions of smoothness and continuity. Because if the contemporary moment, the contemporary technique-driven moment, is about developing the coherence of an object through the literal continuity of form and curvature, the Sperry topsider is doing something very different. It has multiple regions that could be described as smooth or continuous, like this leather surface of the upper or the side of the shoe. But in the construction of the shoe itself, it has these kind of chunky moments that stitch together the smooth curvature of these topological regions. So the kind of bright white stitching on this black supple shoe is not so much a discontinuity, it's like a chunk that stitches the two together. And it's the chunkiness or grittiness, or I guess we could also call it the unsmooth or unblended quality of this object that we're fascinated with, because it doesn't lapse into collage. It's not just a kind of cut and paste operation of an upper, a side, and a sole. It's topologies joined by chunkiness or joined by these larger, semi-disruptive moves. So we're kind of very enamored with the aesthetic of the Sperry topsider and how it's able to achieve coherence, even though it seems to be breaking the rules of a contemporary technique-driven moment that would tell us that coherence and the avoidance of collage has to be achieved by a kind of relentless pursuit of single surface morphologies, or morphologies that can be described by a single topological or geometric system. Just to orient you to the project a little bit, excuse me. These are all the desks for the brokers around the perimeter that are plugged into what we'll call a kind of structural wallpaper that suspends them off the surface of the floor. At a certain point, the wallpaper develops an agency and peels off and provides the semi-enclosure for the lead broker. In the center, there's this conference room. I believe I can see about 4 or 5 people. That's sort of a soft partition that can be drawn closed with this double layer curtain system. And then of course, the client is insisting on the Barcelona chair, but he can't afford the real one, so you'll see a bunch of fakes in the picture. So to kind of draw a correlation between the perspective plan in the last shot and the actual constructed space, conference room, this sort of structural wallpaper, and then these desks that hang off of it. So this is our attempt to play out the aesthetic of the Sperry topsider and find a way, without resorting to collage, of joining a kind of smooth topology with chunky connected regions. So it turns out to be, for us, a kind of double CNC fabrication problem, where we're allowing the surface of the individual working desk to be very simple profile cuts that interface with their surroundings in these super rough, seam-like slot fits that are kind of overscaled. They're about 1 inch square. And they interface with this kind of smooth, continuous structural wallpaper that's eroded in places to receive these desks. Here's a detail shot of the structural wallpaper, the kind of smooth undulation of the topological surface that I guess is being used as more than just a dummy. It's an attempt to find a kind of visual resonance with the curtain fabric of the conference room that can be drawn closed. But in a certain sense, it's also just an excuse to develop smooth undulation that can be interspersed with these kind of 1 inch moments of chunkiness that allow the desk to hang off. So again, as in the last project, we're very interested in a kind of loose fit that doesn't over-calibrate the rhythms of the undulating topological surface with the moments at which the desk interfaces. So there's a simple kind of move of intersection of one plane with another that erodes these topological surfaces and gives us what we'll call these residual kind of slug figures that play themselves out across the space and kind of become a hallmark characteristic of the wallpapering operation. So the loose fit of the cabinetry, not only the desks are hung off the surface of the floor, but also all of the storage infrastructure. And again, that's kind of a pragmatic move just to maximize the amount of available square footage because it's only a 500 square foot space. And so we have this kind of pragmatic excuse to do something that's actually pretty extreme, which is cantilever a 200-pound MDF desk off of this very thin layer of milled surface. So for us, there also becomes a kind of moment of post-rationalization of this project where we start to think about the consequences of having wallpapered a real estate agent's offices. And for us, it kind of seems a fitting way to operate in a tenant improvement package for a real estate agent because real estate agents occupy this kind of funny zone where they're not exactly selling process and they're not exactly selling objects. So the kind of classic case of an object for sale might be kind of the groomed scape of a Tiffany's window where they're attempting to set off a diamond or set off a piece of jewelry. You have this kind of hyper-articulated landscape that is meant for the display of a single object. A convincing process for sale might be the interior of an insurance office, where the more reassuring insurance office interior is not hyper-articulated as a landscape that's meant to show off the employees, but is rather about communicating a kind of banal seriousness, that it's intentionally boring and intentionally dumb. Those kind of coincide with strategies for ornamentation, that objects for sale frequently have a higher degree of ornamentation and sort of their surrounding presentation than people who are selling the process. And again, for us, real estate agents occupy this sort of middle ground where they're showing themselves as the object that's for sale. You've got to like your real estate agent and find them somewhat attractive. But they're also trying to masquerade as kind of serious participants in finance. So there's this kind of tricky balance between needing a sort of flashy saturation of the graphic environment or the spatial environment, and at the same time needing a kind of neat and precise organizational scheme that puts everything in its place and reassures the customer that at the end of the day, this is a kind of serious financial business. So the desks for us become the excuse to do the work of being serious, and the undulating panels and the kind of structural wallpaper do the work of giving us a sufficient degree of graphic and spatial saturation that we can kind of display the real estate agent as you might display some kind of object for sale, like a car or a lamp. There's a kind of sidebar about the lamp. As we attempt to groom the aesthetic of this environment, again, there is this desire to kind of borrow seriousness in order to convince clients that this is sort of a serious and respectable place. So these suspended lights, while they're sort of a separate fabrication project in and of themselves, are a sort of rip-off of the 70s steakhouse lamp that's been sort of reread through the lens of kind of contemporary fabrication. And so we can kind of inject sort of a note of clubby old boyness that floats above the head of the real estate agent. And we'll close this project with a shot of the car. All right, next is a class of projects that are called Surefoot. And Surefoot is one of our, I guess we'll call them a kind of staple client. Courtnay mentioned our commitment to sort of building above installation or academic work, although we are involved heavily in academia, and so we appreciate the efforts of people who do different things in installation. But Surefoot has been our excuse to test out a number of ideas in a sort of tenant improvement package universe where we are very tightly tied to a certain set of constraints. Surefoot is a really high-end custom ski boot fitter. They don't actually make ski boots. They make a custom fit of your foot to a ski boot. So you would show up in a Surefoot store and you would buy like a Lang shell. And then there, as you were purchasing the Lang shell, there would be a digital scan made of your foot. There's a CNC kind of bank of equipment in the back room that mills out a custom insert for the ski boot. And then you stand on that custom insert, and there's a rapid hardening foam that's injected around your foot. So when you walk away after this kind of very complex and intricate fitting process, your foot is sort of perfectly formed to the interior surface of this boot. So initially, and I think kind of naively with these projects, we took the process of kind of literalizing their brand spatially very seriously. So we're going to show a whole series of projects that we believe are very successful for us in terms of refining a kind of construction logic and also of deploying a consistent language that is consistent with the Surefoot brand. But I would say that these projects are primarily executed before we kind of stumbled upon fakeness as a strategy. And at the end of the sequence, we'll talk a little bit about the last in the line of Surefoot stores, their flagship in New York, where fakeness makes a reappearance. And we have what we believe is a more successful architectural proposal. So the first is in Vale. For each of these, we attempted to deploy a kind of language of form that uses prepositions to describe its relationship to existing architectural elements. So for those of you who are not grammarians, a preposition is anything that can happen between a bunny rabbit and a law, like in, on, around, through. In Surefoot Vale, this is about the casework, so in this instance, cash wrap and then the display infrastructure of the boots, working in the wall as a kind of thick substrate behind them. A Surefoot store in Aspen that is about casework and the fitting infrastructure on existing architectural elements. So again, the display infrastructure for the boots, adjacent display infrastructure for other things like hats, socks, and gloves, goggles, a cash wrap. And in each case, these elements are arrayed sort of on this existing column grid that happens to fall in sort of very irregular and inconvenient places in the project. If these are sort of difficult to understand, I have to personally apologize. This is for a while I was obsessed with axonometric or paraline drawings, and this would be the result if you sort of cracked open an egg and then drew both halves of drew both halves of that egg in a plan oblique technique so that you could see the entire surface of an interior volume simultaneously. So these are meant to be interpreted as splitting across a diagonal, and you are opening the two interior surfaces so that you can see the entire project at the same time. Now it sort of seems, 3 years later, like a very fussy graphic innovation, but again, at the time, we were very taken with it. This is the Sherfoot store in London. We would describe this as, once again, an on preposition, but in a different way. Here we're not navigating or hanging on an existing column grid, we're on a wall. All the familiar elements of the Sherfoot store are still there, the infrastructure for display of boots and other things, the cash wrap, the digital equipment that scans your foot. And this shows the kind of hanging of the display infrastructure on the wall and its resolution in what we're calling a sort of beaver tail on one end that suspends a big rack of gloves. So for us, where fakeness makes a reappearance and things get a little bit more interesting is in the Sherfoot flagship store in New York. This is on the Upper East Side, more or less near 82nd and 3rd. And here's the kind of a panorama. We won't tease this time and begin with the process, we'll just describe the thing as it is. There are two components. There's this kind of catcher's mitt that stitches together all of the storage infrastructure and the kind of service spaces. So this here is where you have your foot scanned, and then that's the digital scan of your foot is sent out to the back room for milling. These stands that you've seen in all of the Sherfoot stores are what are called foaming and canting stands. They're a tilted or angled surface that you stand on in order to emulate the posture of actually being on the ski slope, so that when the boot is formed in your foot, you get this kind of perfect neutral stance. So anyway, all of this service infrastructure, including the cash wrap, is absorbed in this big catcher's mitt that does the work of kind of soaking up a very irregular space that we were given. In fact, the space has kind of checkered history as another retail outlet. For a while it was a restaurant, another restaurant before that, but certainly not something that's easily suitable for retail. The second component after the catcher's mitt are what we're calling the pokies, that are this vertical display infrastructure for boots. And in a second, we'll talk about how the pokies are motivated by this kind of fake strategy or fake tactic. Here's an unfolded view of the store that kind of elaborates the relationship between the catcher's mitt, again, this continuous folded surface that absorbs all of the service infrastructure and kind of graphically or spatially makes the relationship between those elements clear so that customers can navigate a clear circuit between one station and another. And then the sort of protruding forest of these pokies that are our vertical display infrastructure that are meant for housing boots and shoes, depending on the season. So here's where fakeness makes a reappearance. We'll call this a sort of cooking the books decoy or a sort of fake data experiment decoy. So when we sort of survey the landscape of what our contemporaries do with data-driven diagrams and graphs that are intended to be used as provocations to architecture, we sort of grossly oversimplify things and say that these shake out more or less into two schools. So we can say that there's a Dutch school of data that attempts to diagram an existing or a projected condition, and then the goal is to build a diagram. So to the extent that there is a legible consonance between the diagram or the graph and the actual built work, we call that a successful project in the Dutch school. There's also a little bit closer to home at both SCI-Arc and UCLA, and a couple of other places, what we'll call a formalist school of data representation, where there's this attempt to embed information or complexity in the visual or sensible qualities of a surface. And with both the Dutch school and the formalist school, it's more or less important to get your facts right, that you are representing existing sets of data because your claim to legitimacy more or less rests on your ability to accurately describe an existing condition. Our claim to legitimacy is fake. This is a graph that attempts to describe sales volumes of various Surefoot boot and shoe models as store sales cycle throughout the year. So it's a kind of lopsided graph because they sell a lot more in the winter months than they do in the summer months. And you have these kind of sub-peaks and valleys that describe sales in a particular category. Surefoot never thinks of the sales of their product quite this way. There is a kind of grossly oversimplified cycling in and out of ski boots and shoes, but they're not really sophisticated enough as salespeople to very carefully groom the aesthetic environment of their display infrastructure. So you get this kind of mix of boots and shoes. So what we're really attempting to do is provide a fake graphic that projectively sort of antagonizes the client into thinking that they're already doing something that is in fact not yet being done, but that becomes the excuse for us to sort of spatialize this display infrastructure vertically, so that sales in a primary category are sort of indicated in boots or shoes that sit inside this aquarium surface that's hanging from the ceiling. That whatever the contents of the aquarium are named off to the right, and then you have subordinate models in that category. So, for instance, they might have very high sales in the juniors category. So a junior's boot would occupy the aquarium suspended from the ceiling, and then subordinate junior's boot models would be displayed on the flat surface underneath that vertical hanging aquarium. So here, the graph provokes us into a kind of tectonic arrangement where there's a precarious balance of these vertical display units, or pokies, that are dangling from the ceiling. They're precariously attached to the ceiling, they sort of wiggle, and they're precariously attached to the floor as they lean at extreme angles to the left and to the right. Not so much as a sort of metaphor for the body as it navigates a ski hill, but more as an indication of an alternate set of physics at play inside the store, so that actually the territory of these tectonics and their precarious position with respect to the ceiling and with respect to the ground indicates that you've stepped into a sort of alternate environment when you walk off, I believe it's 3rd and into the store. Because Surefoot sells a process and not an actual object, there is this opportunity for us to experiment with kind of secondary display infrastructure at the scale of the boot or the shoe. So we don't really have to fetishize the shoe, we just have to fetishize the way it's fit. And so we came up with all of these different, we can call them almost torture devices for a shoe, that are meant to indicate the kind of performance characteristics of the shoe in terms of the way it can be scrunched or bent or oriented. But again, because we're not beholden to a brand like Nike, we just have to accurately represent the Surefoot fitting process. We can distribute these like shoe and boot torture chambers in the vertical display units. Once again, a kind of loose fit to the surrounding environment is really important to us, in part because it gives us a chance to soak up a kind of poorly formed found space and assert our catcher's mitt as the kind of spatial device that conditions what's happening in the store. So as this thing is drawn, over and over again, with the exception of construction documents, we rarely show the kind of adjacent material above and below, although in some cases there's as much as 6 feet of empty space above. And we're kind of obsessed with showing that as a neutral or unknown territory out of which this kind of bizarre set of physics hangs and perches and is poised. At moments, the catcher's mitt develops this sort of agency, just like the structural wallpaper in Loftway, and delaminates from the surface of the surroundings. And that happens at several moments to accommodate this, the different servicing infrastructures. Here again, the sort of unknown territory of the spaces above and to the sides are emphasized by the way we detail the connection to the ceiling. So there's this crevice. You can't actually see all the way up into the crevice. You just get a kind of ambient glow down the shaft of the vertical display. And all of this tends to play itself out in terms of a shopping experience as an overlay of a set of circuits as customers move from one set of servicing areas to another and are always forced to navigate this sort of upside-down forest of vertical display and its precarious set of physics. All right, second to last project. This is one that is in progress at this moment. It's 3/4 of a mile long. And we would say that the contemporary moment is perhaps more interested in extreme small scales, where the kind of scale of computer-controlled fabrication is more easily perceived in human interaction. So it's huge. It's in Houston. It's cut off from downtown by a series of freeways in an extremely blighted urban area. And it's a competition being run in part by the Chamber of Commerce and in part by a group of people who are very interested in sustainable design, but only sustainable design as it relates to the remediation of stormwater. So it's this kind of bizarre confluence of ambitions, and which makes it a sort of unattractive proposition for a competition entry, with the exception of the idea that we can use this stormwater remediation portion of the program as an excuse to start to think topologically about issues of flow and saturation and the speed of water as it moves across the surface and is eventually re-injected into Houston's stormwater system. So this I did not know. Houston actually gets more annual rainfall than Portland, Oregon, or Seattle by about 20 inches. And flash flooding is this enormous problem in some blighted neighborhoods that are underserved by the city's stormwater system. So here are views of the existing streetscape. There's not a lot there. There are these kind of empty, bombed out blocks with these kind of half-constructed or half-demolished buildings on all sides. The ambition of the proposal is to turn this half-mile-long stretch of street into a pedestrian promenade that connects a proposed Houston Major League Soccer Stadium on one end with a Houston Chinese decorative style garden on the other. And to stitch the two together with a kind of convincing infrastructure for shopping and hanging out. So for us, in this project, fakeness and the decoy moment are about the very serious analysis of the Kentucky Fried Chicken spork as a precedent for this project. So for us, the spork is this, just like the topsider, a very beautiful and kind of delicately constructed object that poses very special problems and complications for contemporary topological practice, or practices that are interested in topological issues. On one end, the spork is this kind of multivalent performance tool that can scoop gravy and also spear chicken, and has a kind of intimate or complex relationship with the chicken that it's spearing because of the careful consideration of the way the barbs are formed at the end. And then smoothly in the body of a single surface and this kind of single move, it goes from being a kind of performance-driven object to something that is figural and decorative, but it never breaks its topological stride. So Colonel Sanders and Kentucky Fried Chicken as a logo are seamlessly integrated into this performance-driven spork that resolves itself into a fork and a spoon at the other end. And that kind of unholy combination of the figural and the sort of performance-driven topological seems to us to be very fertile ground to position ourselves apart from modes of contemporary practice. So we propose essentially laying a spork on top of this half-mile long stretch of neighborhood between a proposed Major League Soccer stadium on one end, and the decorative gardens in a Chinese style as they're described in the brief at another. And in order to accommodate program, we understand that the sport is perhaps too flat, that we need a method of enriching the surface and making it manifold so that we can provide surface territory for multiple programs stacked on top of one another. And we're borrowing from Renee Tom's fold catastrophe as a move that would allow us to make the sport manifold or stack its properties at one end. The result is a hybrid sport catastrophe, we'll call it, that at one end has a flat surface that's elevated above the ground that serves as both a giant roof and also a spot to tailgate, which I guess is going to be a major anticipated activity outside this new soccer stadium. And at the other end, it becomes a manifold surface where 3 or sometimes 6 sets of surfaces are stacked on top of one another, each of which contains a distinct or discrete programmatic element. So we're very interested in the way that the hybrid sport catastrophe transitions smoothly like the Kentucky Fried Chicken sport end to end. So along the long axis, we move from being roof to being something embedded in the ground seamlessly. As we start to unravel the strands of this spork catastrophe, we get bizarre coincidences and mixing of programs sectionally. So we're starting to think about the way in which these different strands that transition smoothly end to end can be complex when you navigate them vertically and transition kind of like a system of airlocks between one programmatic environment and another. The response to the brief in terms of how we're going to handle stormwater is actually that this region doesn't have enough stormwater. So at the end of the stadium, or the stadium end of this sport, we want to collect more stormwater on the surface of this giant roofscape and send it down to a series of lakes in the middle to kind of tail end of the figure, that when they fill up with stormwater can spill over into a cistern that will slow down the speed of flow and allow stormwater to percolate back into the Houston stormwater system. So the idea is that the stadium is an interesting and exciting place to be. It doesn't need help, but this garden sounds awfully boring. So at one end, we just need to stay out of the way of the stadium and supplement it in a kind of infrastructural sense by shielding people from the rain and then also providing a supplemental surface for tailgating. At the other end, we actually need to collect more water to provide a spectacle or a kind of highly figured and interesting environment that will compensate for the boringness that occurs as this environment sort of tails off from one end of the half-mile long pedestrian promenade to another. Sighted, our figure interfaces with the stadium. We're cantilevered over it, about 50 feet off the ground, and later we'll see a kind of column infrastructure that supports that flat surface. There are a series of ways to navigate up and down between the stadium and this flat tailgating surface. As we move toward the ground and toward our form or our sport being embedded in the surface of the surrounding territory, this transitions from a performance and infrastructurally driven device into one that is topologically driven at the scale of the human figure and allows us to collect water in these lakes that are navigable in a series of stepping stones that we'll see in just a moment. So looking down from the top of the sport where it's relatively featureless and infrastructural toward this neck moment where it undergoes a catastrophe and moves from being a single surface project to one that is manifold with sections stacked on top of one another, looking down toward the lake surface. Navigating the surface of the lake through this corrugate that gets cropped to provide a means of navigating across the surface of the water. And then in section, we'll see that there are these kind of cistern moments where water is allowed to drizzle down the surface of a kind of egg form to the cistern below as soon as the top surface lake becomes overfilled to capacity. And that's the same moment at which we're permitting circulation down to a parking level. So in section, we move from a kind of flat infrastructural moment at the stadium end again to a manifold moment where the bottom condition is a cistern that retains slow overflow water, a middle zone that's allocated to parking that becomes accessible because of this transition at the neck of the catastrophe moment that allows one to circulate down. These hollow eggs that hold one surface apart from another and allow the water to sort of drizzle down the surface of a stairscape that we'll see here in a moment. All right, it's a little pale. Okay, here we are. So here's an unfolded version of the site plan that begins to talk a little bit about the continuity of transformation and program along the long axis of the sport, and these moments of hard transition or programmatic mixing as you move into the manifold section area of the project and you begin to skip between strands. So a concession or service area that is loaded along one side of the project becomes stacked on top of a sort of swamp-like environment that punctures through to the parking below. And at other moments, parking that's housed in sort of the middle sandwich of this fork hovers between the top surface of the lake where people can navigate by stepping stones and this kind of murky bottom cistern area that's just filled with stormwater runoff waiting to be remediated and absorbed back into the ground. Each of these moments along the spork, we've decided to try to test in a sort of qualitative way. So testing them in the sense that we are posing them against the human figure and as possible indications of how one could occupy this thing and the sort of feeling qualitatively that one gets from traversing the surface of this project. So at the zone of the lake where we're collecting surface water, we're imagining that this kind of becomes a murky swampophilic environment that collects sediment over time, and an aquaculture outside of the control of our project will slowly emerge. Here are these egg forms that I've been describing that hold the surface of the parking slab apart from the top lake surface, that also permit water to run down the side of the same volume that houses a stair. As soon as water runs down the side, it gets trapped in this cistern zone that we're imagining will be sort of like the bottom of the rabbit hole, a place where no one will really hang out, but is constantly implicated through these kind of edge and hole views as we puncture the surface of the parking slab and look down to the left. There's an ambiguous moment of transition at the neck of this spoon or this fork where it undergoes its catastrophe and becomes manifold, so that there's, again, access to parking from below, and there's this down the rabbit hole moment where we imagine that the system will be kind of oozing affect and the dirtiness and swampiness and kind of humidity of all of this enormous volume of trapped water below the surface will start to ooze and leak up from 0 and negative grades up the ramp to the infrastructural portion of the sport that interfaces with the stadium. At the moment of interface with the stadium, this becomes a kind of dry infrastructural project that is about moving people and cars up and down and providing the surface for tailgating, and at the underside provides shelter from rainwater when it's pouring rain and flash flooding use. Okay, this is the last project. It's called Villa Down the Rabbit Hole. It's also a project, a real one in Silver Lake that was commissioned by two sort of madcap clients. It's an artist couple who purchased a house that has no interior walls. And it's not sort of a romantic lack of walls in the sense that a loft might not have walls and you get this kind of blending of kitchen spaces with living spaces and whatever. It's just that the house has no interior walls. So they need a bedroom. And because they are kind of avant-garde and radical couple, they want the bedroom in their backyard because they enjoy camping. So that's the brief we were given. Put a bedroom in our backyard, we like camping, period. For us, this became an excuse to start to think about how extreme structural consequences can again proliferate under the kind of crushing weight of earth piled above. So at the outset, this is a project that becomes a kind of practical fabrication issue where we want to move from the normal condition of a set of sliding doors that are pretty orthogonal and square to a kind of round, totalizing environment at the back end that's volumetric and spatial and kind of sensuous in terms of the interiority of that form. And so we begin just by experimenting with a number of grid configurations that could be overlaid with a really simple system of fabric or burlap, and then kind of shotcreted it in place so that the result is this kind of deliberately messy, kind of, I would call it an almost upholstered condition on the interior, where the concrete bulges against the fabric surface against which it's being built. So at a certain moment, there's this kind of crisis where the project of model making actually decouples itself from the project of finding the form of the interior of this house. So interns start building catenary models and small-scale figures make an appearance, and we end up with this model that I would argue is kind of the current state of the project, and is also the most fake that the project has been in terms of the way it is addressing the problem of form finding and the structural capacity of this thing that's intended to resist the crushing load of earth above it. So whereas we begin with kind of simple suspension of strings along one axis and weighting them to find the form of an efficient arch that can resist the load of earth above, we start to manipulate those strings and magnify the number, or proliferate the number of touchdown spots so that we can very carefully control the exact form of the arch that we create, so long as we're willing to sacrifice a certain degree of structural efficiency. So this model actually becomes a kind of harp that we can play or tune depending on the concessions that we're willing to make in terms of structural efficiency. There's a kind of gradient scheme that begins to indicate our transition from the normal condition that has to interface with the orthogonality of these kind of off-the-shelf Home Depot doors, and then becomes hot as we move toward the bulbous back end of this thing that supports a kind of more qualitative, experiential reading of the project. As we work, the model actually starts to become a project in itself, in that we become fascinated not only with the simple form-finding exercise, but with the idea that the project is injecting a sort of illegal arts and crafts and sort of weaving operation into hardcore architecture that is normally about concrete and glass and steel. So to the extent that we become very interested in the length of embroidery floss at the end of this model, or exactly how a knot is formed, or how loops start to begin to alter the physics of the string under stress and load, we're very interested in that as a kind of disciplinary transgression, because we know that we should not be preoccupied with embroidery floss, and that this kind of careful knotting or the weaving aspect of it is a kind of novel importation or introduction into hardcore conventional architecture. So those obsessions begin to play out at an ever finer scale, so that looping becomes weaving and interlacing. And in order to manipulate this thing, it requires an incredible amount of grooming and sort of massaging, so that the model actually organizes an environment around itself and begins to manipulate the territory that it occupies. And that's the end. Thank you so much. So I guess it's tradition to ask questions if you want to ask any, otherwise I'll go have a drink and have dinner. All right, thanks again, guys.